Okay. Well, welcome everyone. We are, I think, ready to start. Yeah, Rahime is here. All the presenters are here. Today we are going to talk about a very important topic, even though it's like Corona days and everybody is nowadays talking about the pandemics and, with reference to pandemics, different aspects of pandemics like economics and pandemics, politics and pandemics, so forth and so on. But I think what we are going to talk about today with this very important panel is, the issue of gender in politics, and with a specific focus on diplomacy. We all, I assume we all are aware of the fact that it is a very important and unresolved topic yet, the equal treatment of men and women in foreign policy. It's maybe better to start with not a foreign policy, but I assume most of our, participants and also the panelists here are aware of this very famous book of Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, right? This is a very interesting read, a nice read, but it's been some time that I have read that book, and I was quite critical of the book since then. And unfortunately, over the time, like 20 years maybe passed, my opinion has not changed about the book. And unfortunately, again, the equal treatment of men and women in politics cannot be progressed in the same way. And even though it seems like a funny book, I think it is. It lays a lot of problems in terms of gender in politics. We know that from the very beginning of history, foreign policy, foreign relations, international relations, until the middle of maybe the 20th century, diplomacy has been associated with a male-dominant, institution, and the role of women were just about, diplomatic wives or diplomatic daughters. Women, the role of a woman was accompanying the husband, who was a diplomat, and of course, over maybe the 70 years since the Second World War ended, things have been improved. But we don't know at which, level there has been improvement in this topic. It was maybe not until the First World War, the first few women became members of democratic governments in most of the international organizations, starting from the end of the Second World War. We have rarely seen like secretary generals of those institutions, like the heads of the executive of those international organizations. Even though those organizations have mentioned systematically gender equality, we know, for instance, the Declaration of Equality of Women and Men at the Council of Europe, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals specific goal on gender equality. There has been like a systematic attempt to, put or keep this topic at the core of international relations. But of course, I'd better stop here because, first of all, it's not my field of expertise. But moreover, I think we have a very distinguished panel today who are going to talk about, the gender in diplomacy, and maybe they will deal with like, women diplomats with reference to a women in diplomacy point to women's diplomacy. Maybe there is a transition, if there is a transition. Or is it just like a fairy tale to talk about women in politics and diplomacy? This is a very interesting question. And we'll start with the panel delving into these questions. We have the panelists from Koç University, Professor Bahar Rumelili. She's a professor and Jean Monnet Chair at the Department of International Relations at Koç University, and she's been working on this topic for a long time. She also has been the author of several books, like Who Are the Europeans, What is Europe, Conflict Resolution and Ontological Security, Constructing Regional Community and Order, and she has led several projects. I think it is the recent one, right? Bahar, the future of EU-Turkey relations, the gender and diplomacy, Turkish diplomacy, I guess. So, and the second speaker is Rahime Süleymanoğlu-Kürüm. Rahime has recently joined our department, so we are very glad to have you here, Rahime, in our department. You brought an incredible twist to the department. Rahime Kürüm is an assistant professor of our department. Her primary research areas lay in Europeanization, EU foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, EU studies with a focus on gender and diplomacy, of course. And she is currently working on a project which explores gender norms and practices in diplomacy founded by Koçkan Gender Studies. So I would like to leave the floor to this very distinguished panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing and learning a lot about gender norms and diplomacy. Before we start the panel, as for the audience, you all are muted. We'll leave the floor to the panelists, and with this digital technology, what I strongly encourage you is to write your comments or questions, during the panel. On this chat zone here that you see, there is like a chat room that you can type your comments or questions. If you can please address which specific, speaker you address the question, that would be great. And yeah, I leave the floor to Bahar, who'll start first. Bahar, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And yes,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ebru, for this very kind introduction. And I really like the way you kick-started the topic with the metaphor of men are from Mars, women are from Venus. So there is, in recent decades, the growing presence of women in international relations, in highly important, high-profile positions such as Secretary of State, Foreign Minister, and in addition, there is the growing presence of women in lower ranks of diplomacy, constituting a larger majority in the diplomatic corps of the countries. So along with this, of course, has come more scholarly interest in the impact of this changing gender makeup in diplomacy on the conduct of foreign policy, how it affects diplomacy as an institution. In other words, one of the key areas of interest is whether the growing number of women are moving international relations from Mars to Venus, to continue with your analogy. Okay, so I'm actually kind of new to the topic. It started out as a kind of a side project for me, but gradually I became very highly drawn into it. And from the beginning, we have been working on this project with Rahime, and we are very happy to be sharing some of our results with you today. Our focus has been how the changing patterns of women's representation in Turkish diplomacy, and how this is affecting Turkish diplomacy, and how changes in the nature and direction of Turkish foreign policy is also affecting the presence of women in Turkish diplomacy. So I think it is very important to start with a historical perspective on the role of women in diplomacy, because this was one of the things that highly surprised me when I started working on this topic. We actually find that in earlier periods of history, women were actually very highly active in diplomacy when it was conducted more informally and outside of formal channels and bureaucratic procedures. Women of the court in many European states, as well as women of the court in Ottoman Empire, were quite involved in practices such as exchanging letters with one another, giving gifts to one another, and also we also see that in that period, war was considered to be a male domain, whereas diplomacy, the attempt to resolve disputes through peaceful means, was considered somewhat feminine and a kind of a women's domain. So in fact, Ottoman sultans would, in the 15th and the 16th century, would, when they didn't want to fight a war, they would, introduce women into the contacts and try to solve the outstanding disputes through the involvement of women. So actually, women, while historically playing important roles in diplomacy when it was carried out more as an informal activity, they are removed from the practice of diplomacy when diplomacy becomes a formal institution which is carried out by foreign ministries of different countries and becomes subject to formal procedures. And this is what we see actually happening after the 1815 Congress of Vienna. So then afterwards, the evolution of the role of women in Turkish diplomacy very much follows European patterns. The Ottoman Ministry of Foreign Affairs is established in 1836. And following that, Mektebi Mülkiye is established as an all-male school of public service in 1859. And the first female graduates of Mektebi Mülkiye, they graduate in year 1933. In 1913, a legal change allows women to start working as civil servants in government in Ottoman Empire. And the first female diplomat of Turkey is Adile Ayda, and she starts serving in year 1932. But while entering the Turkish Foreign Service in 1932, she resigns 2 years later. This is because in 1934, a new regulation comes into effect which prohibits the posting of female diplomats to foreign missions. And then she thinks, what is my function in diplomacy if I cannot serve in a foreign mission? And then she only returns to the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1957 when this regulation is lifted. Now, of course, such a regulation, you may think, in today's terms is so highly discriminatory. But we see similar, if not identical, restrictions being put on the participation of women in diplomacy in other countries as well. In many countries, for example, there are bans implemented on women getting married, women diplomats getting married. So you may imagine, the rationale behind such a ban. It is thinking that if, women diplomat becomes married, then she will not be able to represent her country. She will be influenced by her husband. And so it is very much based on assumptions about women's role in the family and women's sense of autonomy and independence. So Turkey's first female ambassador is Filiz Dinçmen, and her first ambassadorial appointment is to The Hague in year 1982. And in year 1998, another regulation which was limiting the participation of women diplomats in Turkish Foreign Ministry, which prohibited diplomatic couples from being posted to the same mission, is also lifted. So we see with the changes in these regulations, a highly increasing number of women entering into diplomatic service in Turkey. So if we can, well, first let me say that the first part of our research was quantitative. In years 2015-16, we were fortunate to have a very close collaboration with Turkish Foreign Ministry and their Human Resources Department. We were given access to all their employment data and the gender makeup of that. So we could obtain information about how many women, how many male diplomats are being posted to different missions all over the world. Unfortunately, after 2016, we first kind of gave a pause to this research because we thought after the coup attempt, all the bureaucracies and especially the human resources departments are under very increasing pressure. But afterwards, we have witnessed various difficulties in finding a very collaborative counterpart in Turkish Foreign Ministry. So much of the data and the patterns that I'm going to be discussing today is based on this original data we were able to obtain in 2015 and 16, and to the best of our ability we have been able to find information about the very current numbers. So first of all, in this table, I think you can clearly see how the percentage of women in different employment categories in Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has risen drastically over the years. In 1990, only 13% of career employees in Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs were women. By the year 2019, that has risen to 36%. Of course, this is considerably lower than, half, so we cannot talk about an equal representation, but there is a dramatic increase. You may also notice in the table that there is another category where women's representation has always been stronger, which is the category of consular and expert officers. So the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs admits employees in these two employment categories. But the difference is that if you're admitted as a consular officer to the Turkish Foreign Ministry, you don't have the potential to be promoted to the rank of ambassador. So at lower ranks, you do the similar tasks and jobs, but as a consular officer category employee, you cannot become an ambassador. So again, we see in terms of a gender division of labor, in the employment category, which is kind of less prestigious, there was always a stronger representation of women. And now at present, we've seen that the percentage of women in the two categories have tended to equalize. What about ambassadorial positions? Because this is the position in the foreign ministry with the highest degree of prestige. Compared to the number of overall employees, of course, the representation of women in ambassadorial rank is much lower. In 2014, it was still at 14%, and now today it has come close to being a quarter of the ambassadors in Turkish Foreign Ministry being women. From the time of being admitted to the Foreign Ministry, it takes about 20 years to become an ambassador. So what we have been told in the interviews is that the growing number of women in the Turkish Foreign Ministry is going to translate over the years into an increasing number of female ambassadors of Turkey as well. We also looked at where women diplomats and ambassadors are posted in foreign missions. And I think we were able to find very interesting patterns. So when we look at the distribution of women diplomats and ambassadors and male diplomats and ambassadors to different foreign missions, we see that share of women ambassadors is lower in countries with higher military and economic power. This is quite interesting and I think significant to take note of, not only in the Turkish context, but also in the global context. We see that countries are, for example, quite reticent to assign a women ambassador to the Washington, D.C. mission or to Moscow or to places, to other foreign representations which represent very important countries to that country's foreign policy. So therefore, share of women both as ambassadors and as diplomats is lower in countries with higher military and economic power. Instead, women tend to be disproportionately posted to countries with higher levels of gender equality. In the Turkish context, this is also justified with the motivation to present a favorable image of Turkey abroad. So Turkish women ambassadors have been more commonly, at least in the initial years, posted to European capitals, to countries with higher levels of gender equality to portray a more modern image of Turkey abroad. And then when we look at compare countries in terms of the level of security risk they pose, we see that the share of women diplomats and ambassadors is lower in countries with higher security risk. This is because a paternalistic attitude toward women still prevails in Turkish Foreign Ministry, and they don't want to be faced with the accusation that they have put their female employees in danger. And then we see many more women representing Turkey in international organizations and in multilateral diplomacy. So women are considered to be much more effective in international organizations. In fact, we were told that in our interviews that women do a much better job because they are very focused on specializing in specific issues. So, women do a better job in international organizations. Whereas men male diplomats and male ambassadors tend to be more preferred to be posted to bilateral missions. And finally, again, when you look at the data about where Turkish women diplomats are now at, you see a lot of them are posted to the center. And this is very much a result of their own preferences, because normally the rotation system in the Turkish Foreign Ministry is such that you serve 4 years abroad, then you serve 2 years in center, and then you serve 4 years in another location. But as Rahime is going to discuss next, women diplomats experience a lot of difficulty and challenges in juggling together their private lives, their family lives, and their professional lives. Whereas diplomatic wives often accompany their husbands to all foreign missions, and they don't complain about not being able to work and just hosting cocktail parties. Women diplomats cannot always convince their diplomatic husbands to accompany them to these different countries every 4 years and just, do these tasks. So therefore, in order to keep their family intact, many women diplomats and ambassadors ask for longer stays in Ankara at different points in their careers. Therefore, we see more women present in the center than compared to the proportion of women in foreign missions. So finally, before I turn the floor to Rahime, I would like to show this newspaper clip we actually found in Hayat magazine about Turkey's first diplomat, Adile Ayda. And then you can see it says the title is Aklınıza Yalnız Erkek Gelmesin, Ekselans Hanımefendi. Roma'da vazifeli ilk hanım seferimiz müzakere masasında yabancı diplomatlara aman vermiyor. And underneath the picture, you see it says yaman bir hanım. Adile Ayda, şimdi ben artık kadınlıkla erkekliği bir arada yürütmeye çalışıyorum diyor. Maybe there are non-Turkish speakers among us, so I want to apologize for reading this out loud in Turkish. But basically, Turkey's first female diplomat says that now I'm trying to manage being both a man and a woman at the same time. And I think this comment really shows the fact that you can be increasing the number of women in an institution, whether it's university or whether it's diplomacy or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but that doesn't automatically change the gender norms of that institution. Instead, women are expected to play what are still considered to be masculine roles. They are expected to perform according to masculine norms. So a key point of our interest, and this is what we have tried to analyze through interviews, is to what extent the growing presence of women in Turkish diplomacy in the patterns that I have just described is actually shaping and changing the masculine structure and the already institutionalized masculine norms of Turkish diplomacy. So now I would like to turn the floor to Rahime. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was a very important
Thank you.
Thank you. And Rahime, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much, Bahar Hocam and Ebru Hocam. Okay, so I will continue with the comment of description of comment of Adile Ayda, and I want to express and explain how the Turkish diplomats view gender roles in diplomacy. But before saying this, I would like to emphasize that we interview Turkish diplomats, but they have wide range of experience in other countries, so their views also reflect about general norms and patterns in diplomacy, not just Turkish diplomacy, but in a wider sense, diplomacy. So what they have, like when we turn to interviews, they have like emphasized that diplomacy is not a masculine profession, and this masculine attribute of diplomacy started to be broken in the 1990s. And this was mostly related to, you know, like there are a lot of more independent states now, the number of states proliferated in the international system. And in 1995, there was Beijing Platform for Action, fourth World Women's Conference in Beijing, that led to the signing of Beijing Platform of Action, and gender mainstreaming became an international norm, and many institutions started to change in terms of gender structure since then. So when we turn to Turkish diplomacy, we have interviewed recently retired diplomats, which all they say that there are no gender discrimination, and recruitment on appointments are gender blind, and they are based on merit. So the exam papers are closed, so you don't see their names. Until the interview stage, they cannot see. This is something that appeared in the last couple, I don't know exactly when, but in the last couple of years. And but you know, when we look at the interview, the previously published interviews of diplomats who served in 1970s, they have referred to some of the issues like women have been interviewed longer, like Turkey's second female ambassador Solmaz Günaydın said that you need to be male, graduate of Mülkiye and Galatasaray in order to be an ambassador. So these are like kind of unwritten norms, she said. And she said that women were interviewed for 45 minutes, whereas men were interviewed for 15 minutes. So there was some struggles that they have been facing in 1970s and 80s. And this has been broken in 1990s, but much of this was related to hegemonic masculinity. As Adile Ayda said, we refer to hegemonic masculinity as a norm that women portray an image like a strong and like holders of masculine stereotypes in order to promote. And so the first women diplomats have gone through this kind of norms, and they had to prove themselves by working harder and get themselves accepted. And when we come to 1990s, we also observe that gender becomes, and some of the gender stereotypes cease to be a disadvantage, but they turn to be an advantage, like empathy, understanding the strategies and the feelings of the other party. This became more advantage, and also because there is more multilateral diplomacy, and women were considered to be better at communication, so they could collect better better intelligence. And as Bahar Hocam also mentioned, contribution of female diplomats was considered predominantly with their appearance, and also just being women, because they can portray a positive image of women, and that's why they are posted in countries with which performs better in terms of gender equality index. Okay, so we just tried to summarize how male and female diplomats, as we interviewed both of them, refer to the advantages and disadvantages of women and men in diplomacy. And here I would like to start with men. Most of the diplomats that we interviewed highlighted that the greatest advantage of men is that they can serve in everywhere, and they can serve in countries with high security risks, and women can be vulnerable in those places, and that's why this is reflected in numbers, as Bahar Hocam mentioned. And because of the fact that men can be assigned to anywhere at any time, of the day of the year. You can, alter and change their vacations. You can send them to distant places at night. Male diplomats were preferred even by female diplomats to work in their routine. So, and also male diplomats get the advantage of two diplomats because, it's like buy two for the price of one. Because when you employ a male diplomat, you actually get a female diplomat informally, because the diplomatic wives undertake much of the tasks that deal with diplomacy, and especially nowadays, most of the diplomatic wives are better educated. They can make a lot of social events, and they can also start really good communication because they are educated, and also because they are women. They can take over the organization of cocktails and tea parties, where all this information gathering takes place. And the husband just would come at 6 p.m. from the mission, and then everything would be set. But if it is the other way around, then the woman diplomat would not get that benefit. So there is a lot of difference in terms of functioning and effectiveness, they said, employing a male diplomat. And also we asked about what are the attributes of as a successful ambassador, and male diplomats mentioned that rationality most often in the first 5 attributes. So they value rationality as the first and most important the quality of a successful ambassador. But when we turn to women and ask both male and female diplomats about how gender makes a difference in diplomacy, the list of women's advantages was quite wide. You see, I even tried to summarize them, combine them into the same row here. And first they have said that women are quite good in consulates, and consulates are becoming more important with the diversification of diplomacy, like dealing more with the internationalization of migration. They can deal with a lot of citizens living abroad, diasporas, and they can deal with their problems because they are women and they can understand. This is how they've been justified. And they also mentioned a lot about the women having greater accessibility. And they mentioned, for example, that when they assigned in even the countries Muslim countries, wives of diplomats and officials in those countries do not communicate with men, but they communicate only women. So having a woman diplomat then helps in those cases. And also having a diplomatic wife to accompany them helps them in those areas. And also because of the greater the expansion of public diplomacy, like diplomats dealing with and addressing to people, to citizens, women can also have better accessibility in that case. And apart from that, they have mentioned that women are quite active, social, hardworking, and this hardworking attribute they mentioned is quite related to the norms of hegemonic masculinity. So they have always said that they had to work hard because it takes, one of the female diplomats says that it takes almost 6 months for accepting a female diplomat as equal, but then there's no discrimination once they accept this, but it gets hard. And in order to prove that women diplomats can work harder, and this hard work is very valuable in terms of very valuable for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because they don't see the pathway until they're coming there. They just see hard work. And interesting and different from the interviews with male diplomats, female diplomats have mentioned morality most often in the first 5 attributes of a successful diplomat. And it's been always argued that women brings a soft attitude and gentleness, And this attribute is quite important because it helps overcoming problems, because it brings a soft and nice and communicative environment, and where everybody is acting more comfortable and being themselves and trusted. And there's one thing that can be considered as a disadvantage, but also acts as an advantage, because as Bahar Hocam mentioned, diplomatic husbands usually do not accompany their diplomatic wives in their foreign assignments. So they go to, even if they are married, they go to their foreign appointments, overseas appointments alone. This actually gives them access to the profession for 24 hours, so they can spend their times at the weekends and the outside of office hours by doing public diplomacy and giving talks and visiting some of the places that the diasporas and the citizens are living, so they can spend more time in the profession. This is different from male diplomats because they always go together with their family, and then they have to take time off to spend with their family. And so this is kind of like turn to the opposite direction, the advantages and disadvantages of women. And most of the diplomats, both male and female, argued that women now have better education. So they have actually decisively planned to be a diplomat. They train themselves to be diplomats. And so they have trained themselves to have that profession in the future and acquire the necessary qualifications for that, including the language skills. So in addition to this, like working harder, better education made women diplomats a lot empowered than like those diplomats in 40 years ago. And interestingly, and also as Bahar Hocam mentioned about the rise of multilateral diplomacy, we have come across with a very nice research about the conduct of negotiations in the Council of the European Union. And we asked questions to diplomats about whether gender makes a difference in negotiations, because they find a lot of cases of male chivalry and female stereotype reactance, which I'm going to explain in a minute. For male chivalry, man feels woman acting in a stereotypical way, and then he wants to offer a compensating treatment. So male diplomats try to be more conciliatory and more open and nicer and more polite to their female counterparts, and they don't do the same for their male counterparts. So they offer, they do not react so harshly, so they think twice before saying no. And so this turned to be an advantage because, and also I have seen when Abdullah Gül was foreign minister, he invited women diplomats to volunteer for multilateral missions and international organizations. And so this was based on this assumption: women are not treated so harshly in multilateral negotiations. So women get better outcomes because of that. And the female stereotype reactance is, as I said, hegemonic masculinity. So they, female diplomats, when they counter, they feel their counterpart treating them in a stereotypical way. They try to break the stereotype by acting in a more masculine way. So this makes them more harsher in negotiations, or they become less prone to get into agreement. So they have also the great ambition to show themselves, which makes them more like acting opposite to the stereotypes. So the woman stereotype is expected to be more conciliatory, but they act the opposite way. And women are also presented as role models, especially in acting in the foreign assignments to, for example, give talks about women's participation in politics and similar kind of like public diplomacy activities. So they are more empowered, and also speaking, like listening to such stories from women is more convincing, they said. And also because since 1990s, the conflicts have changed, and now we have more humanitarian crisis, and the women's natural attributes of like not driven by conflict, or not supporting any kind of conflict, but more peaceful in nature, becomes a very important tool for promoting a humanitarian foreign policy and the soft power in foreign relations. And I would like to also give some of the quotations from interviews. So, as they argued that diplomatic couples are preferred if diplomat is a male, not the opposite. And one of the participants said that in diplomacy, you are expected to be two people, diplomat and spouse, meaning that diplomatic wife. Environments of diplomatic couples are brighter, both professional and privately. Hence, having a spouse, meaning wife, is very important. Single ambassadors were less preferred. Assessment of a person, this is important, is always done with the qualifications of his wife in mind. Hence, when the wives are good, they make much more positive impact. They should make the same assessment with husbands in mind when appointing a female diplomat, but they do not. I do not recall a husband who is brighter than his diplomatic wife. So this is one of the very striking quotations for me. And also about chivalry, one of the participants said that you can see different things about women's entourage, and women talk more comfortably, and we hardly see women were given hard reactions. As women are softer in every subject, they start the subject in such a mild way, they're not getting heavy and hard reactions. And also he's arguing that gender inequalities no longer exist in the profession of diplomacy, both in Turkey and abroad. And he continued, another diplomat continued, however, it is the case that women's presence gives a soft grace to the environment, and men tend to be more careful, kind and polite, trying not to hurt their female colleagues, which may contribute positively to the effectiveness of women's diplomatic initiatives. And as they have argued that women diplomats were also considered as emblem of westernization and modernity. And one of the participants said that visibility of women would prove to Western civilizations, meaning Europe and America, Turkey's modernity as women's world matters. It would also display a more equitable and gender-just society, and would make significant impact to Turkey's image, and Western nations would appreciate that, as they are also free countries and talk to journalists. And also, along with the diversification of the subject matters and issue areas that diplomats are dealing with, women are getting more empowered, but also because of their feminine attributes or feminine stereotypes still in perception. For example, a female ambassador said that we have also been dealing with such matters as human trafficking, protecting the rights of children, fight against drugs, and combating corruption. We had a lot of female colleagues working on such issues, and I always thought that it would be good if there were even more. Because women work with great care as they think of their own children and other young women. Okay, so these are the striking quotations from the interviews that tells us a lot about that the gender-based stereotypes do not really change much, but the diplomacy is getting more favorable to and consistent with those stereotypes. And women are empowered quite a lot because of the changes in diplomacy, because there is a shift from private to public diplomacy and digital diplomacy. And diplomats now have more responsibilities, but then they have also less authority and less power, because when they're assigned to a foreign country, they because of the lack of communication in the past, they had more power, so they could make decisions, take initiatives. But now they can just easily WhatsApp or Skype call in seconds, and they get consultation from the center. So they don't have that much authority. And also there is a shift from bilateral to multilateral diplomacy, which most of the male and female diplomats that we interviewed highlighted that women make a lot of better outcomes in multilateral diplomacy, and they should be preferred. And also there are diverse range of issues like security, energy, human rights, environment, terrorism, trafficking, humanitarian issues, and sustainable development. So some of these issues empower women much more than men, and also because women diplomats are also better educated, so they can undertake the tasks and duties that male diplomats do. But the male diplomats, according to interviews, comments, cannot do everything as equal as women. And so there are also changes in Turkish foreign policy priorities and areas. And we all know that Turkey is trying to extend the global reach of Turkish diplomacy, and therefore it started a lot of opened up a lot of missions in African countries and many continents in the world. And there's an emergence of humanitarian diplomacy in the case of Turkish foreign policy, and women's natural advantages becomes more clear in humanitarian diplomacy. And also they are dealing with foreign policy. Turkish foreign policy is dealing with the citizens abroad, this famous call of two-track diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy, not towards states only, but non-state actors. And also public diplomacy and image management and development aid. These are all areas that are considered stereotypically women's domain, and that's why women diplomats are empowered in those domains. So also diplomats raised a lot of issues about the changes in the conduct of diplomacy and the declining of their power. I would like to give some quotations in there. And one of the diplomats said that diplomacy stays to be a uniform profession. So there is a very different medium in diplomacy in 2000s compared to the diplomacy in 1950s, 60s. And now diplomats should know their subjects and keep up with these technological developments. Otherwise, they will not be able to match with their counterparts in other countries or fulfill their wishes in any way. They need to update themselves. And another diplomat also said that there's an inevitable decline in the role of diplomats in parallel to the advancement of the means of communication, which makes personal initiatives for part aside. In the few years of the profession, we are not acting as diplomats, but only transmitting messages based on the instructions we were given. And also, diplomats raised questions about, comments about the public diplomacy and image management. One of the female ambassadors said that diplomacy is not only about interstate affairs, but also public relations and people-to-people contacts, which has not been the case in the classical diplomacy, right? Therefore, a diplomat should keep up with the information technologies, use mass media means, and reach out to the public and work with universities, think tanks, and civic institutions. And also, rise of digital diplomacy. One of the interview participants said that we are in an era that ambassadors have to explain their activities in social media. This was previously with a joint press conference, right? Not the social media. And we have to reach all citizens through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for the purpose of public diplomacy and branding Turkey. So these were the issue areas that came out in diplomacy since in an increasing way, albeit incrementally since 1990s. And these issues have empowered women more than men. And I think this is the end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. And while listening to you, both Bahar and Rahime, you know, I was thinking about several issues like how to theorize these things and so forth and so on. There are also very interesting questions that came from the participants. But if I can actually take my position and ask the first question, that would be great. And then I'll leave the floor to the audience, to the chat room. My question would be, you know, based on what you have portrayed us, like over the long term, like starting from the early 90s, you know, or the 20th century, the state of art for Turkish women diplomats. There's, I think, a lot of, you know, data that you've collected in this research. But my question would be more on, you know, the theoretical aspect, because I know that you have also been thinking a lot about the you know, the normative aspect of this research. You know, the question that I can maybe ask would be, you know, how can we explain the rise of pro-gender norms in foreign policy, right? We know that these are like becoming increasingly salient in global politics, and what would you say on the efforts to theorize it, right? In which ways, for instance, such a development, you know, would resist based on findings of your research, resist or resist, you know, in other country settings? What could be like the external, you know, explanatory power of this particular research? Maybe that would be my question. And there's a quick reaction. I've been wondering for a long time that, well, of course, we don't know each and every female diplomat in the world, but we know there are some female foreign policy leaders, right? Like Madeleine Albright in Clinton era. I mean, I'm an IR person, so my question would not be like in any way contributing to your research. I don't really know anything about your research field, but from an IR person's perspective, you know, looking at, for instance, Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, right, during George W. Bush, or even Hillary Clinton in the first Obama mandate, right? We know these women are not like explaining the entire universe of female foreign policy leaders, but these examples had a very dramatic masculine tone in running foreign policy, right? These were like the tough women leaders, very hawkish in foreign policy conduct. So, you know, all these records, like, I think show, this is my contribution, and I wonder whether you agree or disagree with that. But can we say that female leaders, female foreign policy leaders, can have even a harsher or like a more hawkish tone in the conduct of foreign policy, like more masculine than their male counterparts? Well, thank you very much. I stop here, and then I'll give you the floor to, you know, answer the questions that are also in the chat.
Okay. I hope I'm being heard well, because I experienced a little disruption in my connection. Can you hear me well now? Okay. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Ebru Hocam, for these very thoughtful questions. How did this pro-gender norm in diplomacy emerge? It's quite interesting, and just, you know, off the top of my head, because this is not really a dimension I gave very much thought to previously, but I can say that maybe we do observe the same life cycle model kind of being implemented. I mean, the one that, you know, for example, Catherine Sicking and Martha Finamore talk about it. Certainly, leadership from a number of key states, such as, you know, for example, we see the role being played by Sweden. You know, it is coming out saying, I'm implementing a feminist foreign policy, although that is, you know, still not very clearly defined. I think countries observe the examples of others having more women representation in various foreign missions, in multilateral institutions, and then they also observe the advantages that Rahime was talking about, that female diplomats can make in particular settings, in particular issue areas. And they also take note of the contribution of women to promoting a country's image abroad. So all these factors come together, and a lot of diffusion and imitation of each other's practices. So it becomes kind of this threshold is passed, and it becomes more normal to have and to strive for better gender equality in foreign policy. One example that I can give you, I learned from another colleague of mine, is, for example, I thought was very interesting, because many countries, for example, send male ambassadors to Washington, D.C. And as I explained, this is because, that is seen as the most important foreign mission of a country. But guess which country has sent a female ambassador? United Arab Emirates. So you wouldn't believe, a country that we associate with such restrictive approach towards women's careers, etc., is just, in order to present this image, probably, is sending a female ambassador to Washington, D.C. I thought that was very interesting. So I think states are acting both out of interest as well as in a mechanism of adapting to what others are doing, like this logic of appropriateness as well as logic of consequences, and putting more women into diplomatic positions. And for example, when we're talking about women politicians, the examples you gave, Tansu Çiller comes to my mind. And, what was the name of the E Party leader? I forgot now. E Party.
Meral
Akşener. Yes.
Meral Akşener.
Yeah, I mean, leading, a nationalist, male-dominant party ideological structure, So I think that, this is what Rahime was mentioning as female reactants, like women, in order to succeed in gendered institutions, feel like they need to put on a masculine performance in order to demonstrate their authority, their power, and this tendency increases in positions of higher prestige and rank. So, for example, a woman as a consular officer in Sweden may be, acting more in a stereotypical feminine fashion, but if we're talking about a woman foreign minister, then, at that position, then women tend to be acting more in a stereotypically male fashion. And I also looked at the questions which were shared in the chat room. There was a question about comparative patterns. What are the patterns in other countries? Can you hear me? Okay. So luckily, we are part of a research group on gender and diplomacy. So we have the opportunity to get together with people studying different countries. And we, in fact, wrote a book chapter for a volume which included case studies from other countries as well. So from what I can find, of course, there are regional differences among countries. Countries in Europe tend to have a greater proportion of women in their diplomatic services than other regions. But also, in a way, despite these differences, the trend is similar. The pattern is similar. You know, each country is heading for greater representation of women in their diplomacy. So Turkey doesn't seem like an outlier. And I also see a question from Hande Hocam. Very good to see you as well. I cannot see you, but I know you're here. Thank you for coming. The question is, I think, quite interesting, emphasizing that AKP, I mean, the developments you're talking about is happening under AKP government, which has a conservative approach towards women's roles. How do you explain that? Is that a paradox? One thing we can say maybe is that the foreign policy bureaucracy probably has been the one which has resisted political influence the longest. So was able to maintain its own recruitment procedures, promotion procedures independently until very recently, whereas other ministries or bureaucracies have fallen under political influence much earlier. Secondly, the idea of making Turkey a global player on the international scene, like this very ambitious role conception of AKP foreign policy, includes a strong emphasis on diversification, for example, both in terms of issue areas like being active in development projects in Africa and, you know, being the humanitarian leader in humanitarian aid all over the world, etc. So on these, as Turkish foreign policy diversified under this ambition of making Turkey a global player of some sort, this was also accompanied with growing role of women in Turkish foreign policy. So as a result of these both factors, both the relative immunity of foreign policy bureaucracy and the fact that the foreign policy priorities of AKP are not necessarily against women's increasing role, I don't think there has been a tension in that respect. That said, in all of the interviews that we have made, there is a lot of concern on part of retired as well as serving diplomats about political appointments now being made to Turkish foreign policy bureaucracy. So instead of, diplomats going through the various stages and hoops and then becoming ambassadors, we now see a number of political appointments from the top being made to a number of important foreign missions of Turkey. Maybe Rahime has an information about that. I think a couple of these political appointments have been women, although I'm not sure at this point.
Political appointments are women, and in those women diplomats who are coming from below, like from the profession, they, like, I don't have the number and figure, but they are, I have been told in some interviews that they are not given any role even in the center. So they come back from a foreign assignment and they are not given any form of responsibility.
The political appointments, you're saying, right?
No, political appointments, we have some political appointments and not so many actually. Out of, I think, 64, I think only 6 were political appointments, the rest from the profession. But this is the total number, so it doesn't say how many of them are in foreign assignments and how many of them are in the center. And what diplomats said that most of these women diplomats who are coming from the profession, inside of the profession, they are not given any responsibility after they come back from a foreign assignment. So they are just basically sitting at home.
Okay. Maybe Rahime, you've also had the chance to read the questions in the chat room. Maybe you want to respond to some of those.
Okay, yeah, I can try. İdil has wrote a question about what are the Turkish government's top priority issues when it comes to advancing gender equality globally. I don't think that Turkey has such a objective or priority of advancing gender equality in the global stage. Maybe that it was the case in 2011 or so when Turkey was the presidency of the Council of Europe and initiated Istanbul Convention, but I think Turkey is in a progressing list of countries rising anti-gender agenda, not movements, but agenda. So I don't think that is the case. And what else? Mariana, you already answered this question. And Gözde Yılmaz asked about whether our research focuses on challenges of women diplomats faced with either domestically or abroad in advancing gender equality within the foreign policy apparatus. We partially do that because we look at the experience of Turkish diplomats who served in foreign countries, and then we also found cases like some women diplomats, especially those who entered in 1970s, have started some open resistance towards gender norms. For example, the lifting of this 1998 lifting of this regulation which prohibited diplomatic couples serving in the same city, in the same country, or in the same city have been lifted in 1998. Some of the women diplomats raised that they have openly resisted this regulation and they have contributed to its banning, but also they have been facilitated, I think, by the rising international norms. For example, one of the female diplomats mentioned that she has been assigned to United Nations in Vienna as a lower-ranking diplomat, but then there were so many women diplomats, so she wrote to the center that, it is a must that Turkish diplomacy is represented, Turkey is represented also by women. So the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs seems to take these feedbacks into consideration, because this is the time that the radical right came in 1998, and so I think the increase was from 13% of career employees to 24 already in 1998, and then it increased until 2014 only by 2%. So 1990s was quite important in that regard. And what
well, actually,
there
are, I think, two left. One comes from Sercan. Sercan, hello, it's good to see you, and Hande, you too. Sercan asks, what kind of differences are there when we compare the challenges in terms of participation of women in politics and participation of women in diplomacy in the case of Turkey? You roughly touched upon, I think, this, like a bureaucracy versus the politicians, but maybe you want to expand on that a little bit more.
Okay, I can answer this question, and Bahar Hocam can contribute if she wants later. I think participation, like challenges in participation of women in politics and participation of women in diplomacy are quite alike, but the difference is that in Turkish diplomacy, I think they are also, they have been probably like more easier because it's also a part of the westernization agenda. So women were both better educated and also, you know, they wanted to be portrayed in, you know, these Western countries in order to contribute to a better image. And so, yeah, in terms of participation in politics, I think the advance in Turkey was slower, even in the representation in parliament and also the tasks.
I would also agree,
and the deliberation.
I'm just going to pick up Ebru Hocam's point earlier that I think in diplomacy, more international norms are having greater effect on women's participation than domestic norms. And perhaps maybe a point that we didn't make as strongly as we hoped is that I think also the nature of diplomacy is changing. It is becoming also more conducive to greater women's participation. And maybe I can just add a point about, you know, the effect of COVID-19 crisis on diplomacy. We see a lot of now summit meetings being held as meetings like this. And in such environments, a lot of the things that were thought to give male diplomats an advantage previously become maybe not so pertinent. It is less about mimics, it is less about whether you can bang your fist on the table, it is much more about the content of what you say. So men are often credited to be, you know, better and harder negotiators. But how can you do that in an online environment, you know? So maybe the digital diplomacy is also going to create an even greater space for women's participation. So whereas domestic politics in many countries is because of this trend toward more populism and authoritarianism is becoming less friendly to women. I think in diplomacy, different norms are at play, and there are processes that are facilitating greater representation of women. And this is because this is the paradoxical aspect. The importance of this formal diplomacy as a bureaucratic process is diminishing. So a lot of the important foreign policy decisions are made in summits between top leaders, which tend to be all male, mostly male. And then the diplomats are now, they are doing the legwork. In many ways, they're doing secretarial work, they're doing coordination work. So as diplomats lose their importance in the conduct of foreign policy, that's how it is also becoming a more open profession to women. You know, there is actually some claims made in feminist theory that this is usually the case, that as an if an institution loses its importance and prestige and its ability to ascribe high status, then it becomes more women-friendly in a way, which is sad, but in a way I think also demonstrated in the case of diplomacy. Thank you for that question, Selcan. Hocam, nice to see you. Well, talk to you.
I think one interesting thing, just maybe as a follow-up of what you've mentioned, Bahar and Rahime, you know, there was this question about the COVID-19, and you know, there has been like a lot of speculations about, like, since the beginning of the pandemic, media covers that, you know, the female leaders deal with the pandemic's management in a more efficient way compared to the male leaders. So this maybe it seems like a contradiction to my earlier question, right? So the New Zealand case versus Madeleine Albright, for instance, right? So would you like to expand a little bit on this, because we are very curious about, all these issues with reference to pandemics, right? There has been like lots of discussions, without any empirical data, unfortunately, on what's going to happen in the post-pandemic world. So would you like to say a couple of things about, this post-pandemic world kind of projection, and maybe we can close with that. And yeah.
Okay, I'll just say a couple of things and then maybe give the floor for final comments to Rahime. I mean, of course, this is my just gut reaction speculation at this point. But I don't think there is any, paradox in that, because COVID-19 is a health emergency. It is putting the politics of care on the top of the agenda. So it is not surprising that when the dominant issue of global politics is concerning health, humanitarian crisis, care, women leaders, women politicians are considered to be doing a good job. But this agenda is going to shift. So when it becomes then trade negotiations between US and China, or in our case, exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean, they're still going to put male negotiators on the table, and they will say, Trump is doing a good job because he is such a tough negotiator with China. So I think this is just, it's not going to be a long-term trend unless we have one health emergency after another, which I don't think we really want.
Rahime, would you like to add anything?
I think Bahar Hocam said enough about this, but I can shift to question by Gizem Yıldız, if it is okay. She asked, she commented on the Cynthia and Lois book, which we cited in our previous work extensively, and where she wrote that number of women increases in the public space and in the foreign affairs, and it doesn't mean that society is becoming more gender equal. And she said we cannot study gender by looking at the numbers of representatives in foreign affairs. So question is, what the main indicators of gender equal society are rather than numbers? Well, I think this is quite a big question, like what are the indicators of gender equal society? I think we will reach a gender equal society once we have once we do not really feel the need to react that, wow, there is a woman in Washington, while, when everything is just set to be, or our perceptions turn to be normal. Everything is our, I think, awareness and perceptions. I don't think I have a clear answer to this question, but I can just give a comment, information about one of our interviews, who contacted me I think 2 months ago or so, when United Kingdom sent a female ambassador to Washington, and she was the one who said, there is no gender inequality in diplomacy, but then she was so high-tempered and so she was very angry that BBC and many other channels were giving a news about this in a way like there's an alien coming from space. So it sounds really unusual and so surprising. Like she was quite mad and angry about this, and she, I think, started to realize that there is quite inequality in the because when we see a woman in a high position, we get surprised. We don't consider it normal. And I think this is, when we stop doing this, this will be the time that we will have more gender equal society. But I don't know when, obviously.
Yeah, I think we are just on time, and I know that there's like lots of food for thought on the table, but I think it is high time to, you know, end the discussion, which, by the way, I mean, it's probably gonna last for, unfortunately, a long time, that we will continue talking about these things, gender equality, like in terms of the sustainability of what, as Bahar, you mentioned, like what's going to happen after the corona, and you know, under another crisis management scenario, so forth and so on, in terms of, you know, women in politics and diplomacy. I wish I could just invite everyone to a coffee, you know, somewhere in a nice garden under sun after this very nice talk. Well, unfortunately, we have to grab our coffees and, you know, stay in a corner in the house and drink it and, you know, just relax a little bit after the presentations, after this webinar. I want to thank everyone, you know, all the participants, our panelists, you know, it was really very enlightening. I want to thank to both of you, and, you know, we want to read more. And in another occasion, you know, Bahar, it was like 7 years ago or 8 years ago, you were still with us on another seminar, unfortunately this time in a webinar format, but hopefully we will actually be together and continue discussing all these things.
Always a pleasure.
I actually have a word, you know, I have a promise. I'll invite you to, I don't know, a post-seminar drink or lunch. So sometime soon, let's hope that. I want to applaud, right? This was like a very interesting talk and we learned a lot. Thank you very much. And I want to, you know, I think close the session here. I wish everyone a very healthy period, you know, over summers. And thank you again for your presentations, for your talks, Bahar and Rahime.
Thank you very much, and thank you.
This was a great pleasure, and, you know, thanks for all the comments thanking us. Yes, I'm keeping my fingers crossed for an in-person meeting. Although these webinars, I think, work perfectly well. And in some ways, there is a greater interaction with the chat room being available. Still, I'm kind of old-fashioned. I like in-person meetings better. But this was a lot of fun and highly, you know, it generated a lot of new thoughts in my mind as well. So thanks for all the input.
Thank you very much. Take care of yourself. And bye-bye. I close the session.